The Ballantine neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, was the epitome of suburban bliss. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched endlessly along pristine streets, where every home boasted spacious layouts and bright, inviting facades. Among them was the Thornton residence, a stunning colonial-style house that appeared to radiate charm and success. But inside its walls, a far darker reality festered. Emma Thornton had once believed in fairy tales. At 25, when she married Owen Thornton, she thought she had found her happily ever after. Owen, a charismatic real estate mogul 10 years her senior, seemed like the perfect man, successful, ambitious, and deeply in love with her, or so she thought. For a while, their life together mirrored the dream Emma had envisioned. She left her job at a marketing agency to focus on building the ideal home and nurturing their relationship, while Owen promised her a future of comfort and prosperity. But reality has a way of dismantling illusions. By the end of their first year of marriage, the cracks began to show. Owen's charming demeanor gave way to cold indifference. His days were consumed by his real estate empire, and his evenings were either spent on his phone or at networking events, leaving Emma alone in their meticulously curated home. She would wait for him, her heart yearning for even the smallest sign of affection, a smile, a compliment, a kind word, but Owen rarely obliged. Over time, Owen's controlling nature began to surface. He scrutinized every detail of their life, from how Emma decorated the house to what she spent on groceries. Her role as a homemaker became a suffocating routine. Emma no longer felt like a wife but more like a cog in the machine of Owen's well-oiled life. She realized he didn't see her as a partner but as another possession, something to maintain the image of his perfect suburban existence. On the rare occasions Owen was home, their interactions were brief and transactional. Conversations revolved around mundane topics, bills, household maintenance, appearances at neighborhood functions. The intimacy and connection Emma longed for had evaporated. Nights passed in silence, with Owen sleeping soundly beside her while she stared at the ceiling, wrestling with feelings of loneliness and despair. Emma found herself retreating into her thoughts, remembering the vibrant, hopeful woman she once was. She missed the days when she felt alive, when love seemed boundless and filled with possibility. Now, at 30, she felt like a shadow of herself, a ghost haunting the life she had built. Divorce crossed her mind more than once, but the prospect terrified her. Owen had made it clear that leaving him was not an option. "If you ever walk away," he had warned one night with chilling finality, "I'll ruin you. Everything we've built, everything you have, I'll take it all." And so, Emma stayed. Trapped in a marriage that had become a gilded cage, she endured Owen's coldness and her growing emptiness. She told herself that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But deep down, she knew the truth: this wasn't a life. It was a slow, quiet death. By 2020, Emma had emotionally checked out of her marriage, resigning herself to a life of quiet misery. She went through the motions, attending charity galas with Owen, smiling for photos, and pretending for the neighbors that all was well. But inside, the longing for freedom, for something more, grew stronger every day. Unbeknownst to her, the catalyst for change was just around the corner, a man who would upend her carefully maintained facade and set her life on an irreversible course toward destruction. By the spring of 2020, the Thornton home was in dire need of renovations. The elegant facade that once symbolized their seemingly perfect life now bore cracks, both literal and metaphorical. The kitchen tiles were chipped, the paint in the living room had faded, and Owen, ever concerned with appearances, decided it was time to hire a contractor to restore the house to its former glory. That's when Ryan Carter entered Emma's life. Ryan was not the type of man Emma typically encountered in Ballantine. At 30, he exuded a rugged charm that stood in stark contrast to the polished professionals who populated her neighborhood. His hands were calloused from years of labor, his voice carried a natural warmth, and his easy smile felt disarmingly genuine. The day he first arrived at their house to assess the project, Emma found herself drawn to his confidence, not the overbearing kind Owen possessed, but something quieter, more grounded. Their first interaction was brief. Emma offered him a cup of coffee as he measured the dimensions of the living room. "Thanks," he said with a grin. "Most people just want me to hurry up and get to work." She laughed, surprised by how natural it felt to talk to him. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that she had laughed without forcing it. As the renovations progressed, so did their interactions. Ryan often stayed late to finish his work, and Emma would bring him snacks or drinks, using the opportunity to linger and chat. Their conversation started out light, questions about his job, stories about the odd clients he'd worked for, but soon delved deeper. Ryan spoke about his upbringing in a small North Carolina town, his struggles with a failed business, and his decision to start fresh as a contractor in Charlotte. Emma, in turn, shared pieces of herself she hadn't spoken about in years, her love for art, her dreams of traveling the world, and the loneliness that had crept into her marriage. There was something about Ryan that disarmed her. He listened, truly listened, in a way Owen never had. His compliments were small but sincere. "You've got a great eye for color," he'd said, gesturing to the living room's soft blue walls. "Not everyone knows how to make a space feel this inviting." It wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them, as though he genuinely meant them. For Emma, these moments felt like oxygen. Ryan's attention filled a void she had long tried to ignore. She began to anticipate his visits, lingering near the rooms he worked in, finding excuses to spend more time with him. She started to dress with more care, rediscovering a part of herself she thought had been buried under years of neglect. The quiet excitement she felt when she heard his truck pull into the driveway was a stark contrast to the dread she felt every time Owen walked through the door. Ryan, too, seemed to take notice of her. He would glance up from his work when she entered a room, his smile lingering just a little longer than necessary. On one particularly warm afternoon, he complimented her cooking after she offered him a plate of homemade cookies. "You're wasted as a housewife," he teased, his tone playful but not unkind. Emma blushed, the words echoing in her mind long after he'd left. Their connection was undeniable, and Emma found herself longing for more. She tried to rationalize her feelings, telling herself it was harmless, a bit of attention, a few kind words, nothing more. But deep down, she knew the truth. Ryan made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, and each passing day, the line between what was innocent and what wasn't blurred further. By the summer of 2020, Emma was spending more time with Ryan than she was with Owen, though the latter hardly seemed to notice. Owen was preoccupied with his work, oblivious to the slow but seismic shift happening in his own home. Meanwhile, Emma's days revolved around stolen moments with Ryan, brief, electrifying exchanges that felt like a lifeline. What started as a simple renovation project had become something far more dangerous. Emma didn't yet realize it, but the path she was on would lead her to the kind of freedom she craved, and the kind of destruction she could never have imagined. By the start of 2021, the delicate facade of Emma Thornton's life was beginning to crumble. The renovation project had ended months ago, yet Ryan Carter lingered in her thoughts. Their stolen moments had spiraled into a full-blown affair, each meeting cloaked in secrecy and thrill. For Emma, Ryan wasn't just an escape, he was the antidote to years of emotional neglect. But what began as a breath of fresh air was now a storm brewing on the horizon, and Emma was about to lose control of everything. It started with subtle changes Emma couldn't ignore. She began feeling fatigued, her appetite waned, and when her period was late for the second month in a row, a wave of dread washed over her. At first, she dismissed the possibility, blaming stress or her irregular schedule. But as the days passed, the signs became undeniable. Her hands trembled as she stared at the positive pregnancy test, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. The question of paternity loomed large. Deep down, Emma knew the answer: the baby was Ryan's. The timing left little room for doubt, but the implications were staggering. Owen, who had grown more distant yet still demanded control over every aspect of their life, would never forgive her. And Ryan? Emma wasn't sure how he would react, but she hoped, desperately, that he might offer her a way out, a chance to rebuild her life away from the suffocating grip of her husband. Summoning her courage, Emma arranged to meet Ryan at a secluded cafe downtown. She chose her words carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "I'm pregnant," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Ryan stared at her in stunned silence, his face pale. Then, as the weight of her words sank in, his expression shifted to something colder, something that pierced through Emma's fragile hope. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said flatly. The warmth that had once drawn Emma to him was gone, replaced by a defensive detachment. "I can't do this, Emma." "A baby? That's not part of the plan." Emma's heart sank. "It's not just my responsibility," she argued, her voice trembling. "We both did this. I thought you." "Thought what?" Ryan cut her off, his tone sharper than she had ever heard. "That I'd drop everything and play house with you? You knew what this was." His words were a knife twisting in her chest, each one stripping away the illusion she had clung to. For Ryan, the affair had been an escape, a fleeting distraction. For Emma, it had been salvation. Now, she was left alone to bear the consequences. As Ryan walked out of the cafe, Emma sat frozen in her seat, her world unraveling around her. She couldn't go to Owen. The man who controlled her finances, her life, would use this betrayal to destroy her. Divorce wasn't an option, Owen had made that clear long ago. With Ryan gone, Emma felt trapped in a tightening noose, her choices slipping away like sand through her fingers. Unbeknownst to Emma, Owen had already begun piecing together the fragments of her betrayal. For months, he had noticed the subtle shifts in her behavior, her restless nights, her sudden absences, the way she avoided his gaze. Owen was a man who thrived on control, and the thought of losing it sent his meticulous mind into overdrive. When Emma grew more distant, he decided to act. He hired a private investigator to trail her movements, sift through her phone records, and uncover the truth. It didn't take long for the investigator to deliver damning evidence: photos of Emma and Ryan together, text messages exchanged during the renovation, receipts for secret rendezvous. The proof was irrefutable. But Owen wasn't one to explode in anger. Instead, he chose silence, a cold, calculated silence that filled their home with an oppressive weight. He stopped acknowledging Emma, his icy demeanor more punishing than any outburst. She noticed, of course. The tension between them grew unbearable, but she didn't dare confront him. She was too consumed by her own guilt and the fear of what he might do if he knew everything. In truth, Owen didn't just know, he was planning his next move. Divorce was inevitable, but he wanted to ensure Emma paid dearly for her betrayal. He envisioned taking everything: the house, the money, the reputation she clung to. He would leave her with nothing, just as she had left him with nothing but humiliation. By mid-2021, Emma's life was spiraling out of control. Ryan had abandoned her, Owen's cold fury loomed, and the secret she carried threatened to destroy everything. The walls she had carefully built around herself were closing in, and she could feel the weight of her decisions suffocating her. But the breaking point had yet to come. Emma didn't know it, but her choices were about to lead her down a path of no return, one where the line between victim and villain would blur, and the cost of freedom would prove devastating. The summer night was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. Emma Thornton gripped the steering wheel of her car, her knuckles white as she navigated through the dimly lit streets of Charlotte. The air conditioning hummed softly, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, a torrent of anger, despair, and desperation swirling inside her. Tonight, she wasn't going to wait for answers, she was going to demand them. Ryan Carter had ignored her calls and texts for weeks. Each message she sent, pleading for him to meet her, had gone unanswered. The man who once made her feel seen, alive, had vanished the moment the weight of their actions became real. But Emma couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't face the future alone, not with a baby, not with Owen's cold fury looming over her. She needed Ryan to take responsibility. She needed him to care. Her car pulled into the parking lot of Ryan's modest apartment complex in the heart of the city. The building was quiet, most residents already settled in for the night. The glow of a single street lamp illuminated her trembling hands as she parked and stepped out, clutching her phone tightly. She hesitated for a moment, staring up at the second-floor apartment where she knew Ryan lived. The light in his window was on. He was home. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Emma climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she waited. Moments later, the door opened, revealing Ryan. He looked disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his expression guarded. The warmth she once saw in his eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, indifference. "Emma," he said, his tone clipped. "What are you doing here?" Her voice cracked as she spoke. "We need to talk." Ryan sighed and stepped aside, letting her into the small, cluttered apartment. The air inside was stifling, matching the tension that hung between them. Emma turned to face him, her hands trembling at her sides. "You can't keep ignoring me, Ryan," she began, her voice shaking but resolute. "I can't do this alone. I need you." Ryan's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms. "I told you, Emma. This isn't my problem. You need to figure it out." His words hit her like a slap. "Not your problem," she echoed, her voice rising. "You were part of this too. You don't get to just walk away." Ryan's frustration boiled over. "I never asked for this," he snapped. "I didn't ask for a baby, Emma. I didn't ask for your mess of a life. This," he gestured between them, his voice laced with bitterness, "wasn't supposed to mean anything." Emma's chest tightened, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she thought possible. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger. "It meant something to me," she said, tears pooling in her eyes. "I trusted you. I thought." "You thought wrong," Ryan interrupted, his tone ice cold. "This is over, Emma. It's been over." The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in as the weight of his rejection pressed down on her. Years of loneliness, betrayal, and despair bubbled to the surface, igniting a fury she couldn't contain. Her hands clenched into fists as she tried to steady her breathing, but the rage was too overwhelming. "Don't you dare walk away from this," she hissed, her voice trembling with raw emotion. But Ryan didn't respond. He turned his back on her, walking toward the kitchen counter as if dismissing her entirely. Something snapped inside Emma. Her eyes darted to the counter, where a knife lay beside a cutting board. She moved without thinking, her vision blurred by tears and anger. In a single motion, she grabbed the knife, her grip tightening around the handle. Her voice cracked as she screamed his name, and Ryan turned, his face a mix of shock and fear. "What are you?" he started, but the words died in his throat. Emma lunged, the knife plunging forward. The first thrust was blind, fueled by rage and despair. The second, and then the third, came in rapid succession, her sobs echoing through the small apartment. Ryan's body crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him, staining the worn linoleum. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Emma's ragged breathing. She stumbled back, the knife slipping from her trembling hands. Her gaze locked on Ryan's lifeless body, the reality of what she had done crashing over her like a tidal wave. Panic set in, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. The man who had once been her escape was now her undoing. Without another thought, Emma fled. Her feet carried her out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the humid summer night. She climbed into her car, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. As she sped away into the darkness, the weight of her actions settled heavily on her chest. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The morning of June 23, 2021, began like any other in the quiet apartment complex where Ryan Carter lived. The hum of air conditioners filled the humid summer air, and neighbors went about their usual routines. But the unsettling silence from Ryan's second-floor apartment did not go unnoticed. His next-door neighbor, Mrs. Keller, an older woman who kept a close eye on the comings and goings of the complex, grew uneasy. She had heard a loud argument the night before, shouting, muffled thuds, and then a chilling silence. When she noticed his door slightly ajar the next morning, her curiosity turned to dread. "Ryan," she called, stepping cautiously into the apartment. The metallic scent of blood hit her first, sharp and unmistakable. Her eyes fell on the lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor, surrounded by a pool of dark, congealing blood. Her scream echoed through the building, shattering the morning calm. Within minutes, police swarmed the scene, cordoning off the apartment with yellow tape as detectives began piecing together the horrific tableau before them. Detective Sarah Whitaker, a seasoned investigator with the Charlotte Police Department, took the lead. She surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the angle of the wounds, the discarded knife, and the chaotic state of the room. This wasn't a random attack, it was personal. The level of violence spoke of rage, desperation, and an intimate connection between the victim and the killer. The investigation began in earnest. Ryan's phone, lying near his body, became the first piece of evidence. Detectives quickly accessed his call logs and text messages, uncovering a series of heated exchanges with Emma Thornton on the night of his murder. The texts were emotional and volatile, pointing to a confrontation between the two. "Who's Emma Thornton?" Detective Whitaker asked aloud, flipping through the messages. A quick background check revealed her as a suburban housewife living in the affluent Ballantyne neighborhood, a far cry from the world Ryan inhabited. Whitaker's instincts told her there was more to this woman than met the eye. As investigators continued their work, interviews with neighbors painted a clearer picture of the events leading up to the crime. Several had heard raised voices and loud noises from Ryan's apartment late at night. More damning was Mrs. Keller's account. She had seen a car parked near the complex that matched the description of Emma Thornton's black SUV. The evidence was beginning to mount. Meanwhile, Emma was struggling to keep her composure. She had spent the night after the murder in a haze of panic and denial, scrubbing her hands raw as if she could erase the blood that wasn't there. Each knock at the door or ring of her phone sent her heart racing. Owen, oblivious to her inner turmoil, continued his routine with the same detached precision that had defined their marriage. But Emma knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. On June 28, detectives arrived at the Thornton residence. Emma answered the door, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Thornton," Detective Whitaker began, her tone professional but firm, "we need to ask you some questions about Ryan Carter." Emma froze, her mind racing. "Ryan?" she repeated, feigning ignorance. I don't understand." But Whitaker wasn't fooled. The detectives had come prepared. They presented her with the text messages, the witness accounts, and the forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene. Each piece of evidence felt like a nail driving into Emma's chest, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of their accusations. At first, Emma denied everything. "I haven't seen Ryan in weeks," she insisted, her voice shaky. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Whitaker pressed on, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Emma's unraveling composure. By July 2, after days of intense questioning, Emma finally broke. The weight of her guilt, combined with the relentless pressure from detectives, proved too much to bear. Sitting in the sterile interrogation room, her hands trembling in her lap, she confessed. Her voice was barely a whisper as she recounted the events of that fateful night, how her desperation had driven her to confront Ryan, how the argument had escalated, and how, in a moment of blind rage, she had reached for the knife. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. I lost control. I didn't know what else to do." Her confession was damning, but it also painted a picture of a woman pushed to her breaking point. The detectives listened intently, their expressions betraying no judgment. For them, it was another case, a tragedy, yes, but one they were trained to handle. For Emma, it was the end of the life she had known. As she was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her actions settled heavily on her. The cameras outside the police station flashed as reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of chaos. Emma kept her head down, her mind consumed by the enormity of what lay ahead. The investigation had concluded, but the storm was far from over. Emma Thornton was about to face the full force of the law, her private despair laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom was packed on a brisk February morning in 2022, the air electric with anticipation. Emma Thornton's trial had captured the city's attention, a sensational blend of scandal, betrayal, and violence that felt ripped from the pages of a crime thriller. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras poised to capture every moment as Emma was escorted in, her once radiant appearance now a shadow of its former self. Dressed in a modest navy blouse and black slacks, she avoided eye contact, her face etched with exhaustion and regret. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Emma. "This is not a woman who acted in self-defense," declared Assistant District Attorney Linda Harper in her opening statement. "This is a woman who planned her actions, who allowed her emotions to spiral out of control, and who took the life of a man in cold blood." Harper's tone was sharp, her words precise. She described the evidence, the text messages, the eyewitness accounts, the weapon left at the scene, all pointing to premeditation. To the prosecution, Emma was not a desperate housewife but a calculating killer. They highlighted her months-long affair with Ryan Carter, framing it as an escape from a privileged yet unfulfilling life. When faced with the consequences of her choices, Harper continued, Emma Thornton chose violence instead of accountability. Emma's defense team, led by seasoned attorney Michael Connors, took a starkly different approach. Connors painted Emma as a victim, not of Ryan, but of years of emotional abuse at the hands of her husband, Owen Thornton. Emma Thornton was not living the perfect suburban dream, Connors argued. She was trapped in a marriage defined by control, manipulation, and emotional neglect. He detailed the isolation Emma experienced, the suffocating routines, and Owen's threats to ruin her if she ever sought freedom. Connors described her relationship with Ryan not as a betrayal but as a cry for help, a desperate attempt to find solace in a life that had become unbearable. The pregnancy, he emphasized, had pushed her to the brink. Emma didn't go to Ryan's apartment to kill him, Connors stated firmly. She went there seeking answers, support, and hope. What happened that night was a tragic accident born of desperation. Throughout the trial, Emma sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The prosecution called witnesses to testify about the volatile nature of her relationship with Ryan, while the defense presented experts in psychology who spoke about the effects of long-term emotional abuse. The testimonies revealed a complex portrait of Emma, neither wholly innocent nor entirely villainous. The most dramatic moment came when Owen Thornton took the stand. He was stoic, his demeanor icy as he recounted the breakdown of their marriage. He denied the accusations of control and manipulation, portraying himself as a hard-working provider blindsided by his wife's infidelity. Emma's actions destroyed our family, he said, his voice steady but cold. She chose to betray me, and when her lies caught up to her, she chose violence. The jury watched intently, their faces unreadable as Owen spoke. The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, but so did the palpable tension between the narratives presented by both sides. The trial stretched into March, each day drawing more media attention as the public debated Emma's guilt. Some saw her as a cold-blooded murderer, while others sympathized with her as a woman driven to the edge by circumstances beyond her control. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForRyan and #FreeEmma, reflecting the deep divide in public opinion. On March 15, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Emma Thornton, guilty of second-degree murder." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled to relay the news, while gasps and murmurs filled the air. Emma's shoulders slumped, her head bowing slightly as the weight of the words settled over her. She didn't cry, her tears had long since run dry, but her expression betrayed a deep, unshakable sorrow. The judge sentenced Emma to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the trial, Emma's fate was sealed. Owen filed for divorce the very next day, cutting the final thread that tied her to her former life. For weeks after the trial, the media dissected every detail, from Emma's demeanor in court to the psychological arguments presented by the defense. Some called the verdict justice, others called it a tragedy. But for Emma, the public's judgment no longer mattered. Her life as she knew it was over. As she was escorted from the courtroom, the flash of cameras followed her every step. She didn't lift her head, her gaze fixed on the ground. Behind her, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind the echoes of a trial that had captivated a city, and destroyed a woman's life. The clang of the prison gates closing behind Emma Thornton was a sound she would never forget. It echoed in her mind like a gavel striking, marking the final chapter of her life as she had known it. Inside the cold, unyielding walls of the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, Emma began to process the enormity of her fall, from a suburban wife in Ballantyne to an inmate stripped of everything she once held dear. The months following her sentencing were a haze of adjustment. Emma had been sentenced to 25 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 15 years, but the weight of her reality felt far heavier. The outside world had moved on, her story fading from headlines as new scandals took their place. For Emma, however, the repercussions of that fateful night would follow her forever. Owen Thornton wasted no time moving on. Within weeks of the trial's conclusion, he filed for divorce, severing all ties with Emma. He sold the Ballantyne home, the site of their fractured marriage and years of silent resentment, and relocated to another state. Publicly, he portrayed himself as the wronged husband, a narrative the media readily embraced. Privately, he left behind the ruins of a marriage that had rotted long before Ryan Carter ever stepped into their lives. Owen's focus turned to rebuilding his life, both professionally and personally. He distanced himself from the scandal, burying the memories of Emma's betrayal and the chaos that followed. Yet, for all his efforts, whispers of the trial and his role in the fractured marriage lingered in professional circles, a reminder that even he couldn't escape unscathed. Perhaps the cruelest consequence of Emma's choices was the fate of the child she carried. Born in the sterile, impersonal confines of the prison infirmary, the baby, a boy with soft brown eyes and a fragile cry, was taken from her almost immediately. The state deemed Emma unfit to care for him, and the child was placed into foster care. Emma had no say in the matter, no opportunity to plead for the right to raise her son, and no chance to watch him grow. The knowledge that her child would grow up without her was a punishment far greater than her prison sentence. Emma often wondered about him during the long, silent nights in her cell. What kind of life would he have? Would he ever know the truth about his mother? Or would her mistakes forever define the way the world saw him? In prison, Emma's days blended into one another, marked by routine and the slow erosion of time. The woman who once yearned for freedom, for passion, now found herself confined in every possible way. Yet, in the monotony of her days, Emma began to reflect on the choices that had led her here. She replayed every moment, every decision, from her entrapment in Owen's controlling grasp to her desperate pursuit of Ryan's affection. She saw now how each step had been a march toward self-destruction. Despite the grimness of her circumstances, Emma found small ways to endure. She began to write in a journal, pouring her thoughts onto paper as a form of therapy. She attended counseling sessions offered by the prison, though her walls of guilt and regret often kept her from fully opening up. Still, the act of surviving each day became a small victory. Outside the prison walls, Emma's story continued to haunt those it had touched. For the residents of Ballantyne, it became a cautionary tale whispered over coffee at neighborhood brunches. For Ryan Carter's family, it was a source of enduring grief, a reminder of a life cut short by misplaced trust and unbridled emotion. For Owen, it was a chapter he worked tirelessly to bury but could never quite forget. For Emma, the stain of her actions would follow her long after her eventual release. If she ever walked free, she knew the world would not greet her with forgiveness but with judgment. Yet, despite everything, there was a part of her, a small, flickering ember, that hoped she might one day find a way to rebuild, to atone for the pain she had caused. Emma Thornton's story is one of betrayal, desperation, and the devastating consequences of choices made in the heat of emotion. But what do you think? Was Emma a victim of her circumstances, or were her actions unforgivable? Could there have been another way for her to escape her broken marriage and suffocating life? What lessons do you take from her tragic journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below and join the conversation about this haunting true crime tale. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one.